Good evening, and welcome to the 8th annual recognition of the J.P. Hendrickson Faculty Scholar and the presentation of the Herbert Cheever Jr. Liberal Arts Lecture. My name is Lynn Sargent, and I am the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at South Dakota State University. It is my pleasure to be your host this evening. The Cheever Liberal Arts Lecture marks the intellectual high point of the year for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. For the faculty members selected by their peers as the Hendrickson Faculty Scholar, this evening marks their public recognition as an outstanding scholar and a leader in our university's intellectual and cultural life. This year, this award goes to Dr. Mark Freeland, Assistant Professor and Coordinator of American Indian Studies. Tonight's award and lecture are named in honor of two distinguished former professors and administrators in our college. Professor John Philip Hendrickson joined the faculty in 1957. He became head of the Department of Political Science in 1967 and led the department until his retirement in 1988. Herbert Cheever Jr. served as a professor in political science from 1968 until his retirement 32 years later in 2000. He also served as department head, twice served as acting dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and finally served as dean of the college from 1992 until his retirement. Professor Hendrickson and Professor Cheever recognized the value of the liberal arts and committed their careers to fostering a broad understanding of the liberal arts among their students, their colleagues, and our community. They served their department and the college ably and well. The current School of American and Global Studies and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences stand as testimony to the results of their labors. This has been a challenging year for higher education due to COVID-19. In order to ensure the safety of all, we have decided to deliver tonight's lecture in a virtual format via Facebook Live. Although we are separated physically, our hearts are together. In that spirit, I would like to welcome some special guests to tonight's event. Susie Hendrickson and other members and friends of the J.P. Hendrickson family, and Sidna Cheever and other members and friends of the Herbert Cheever family. We are also pleased to be able to recognize tonight the students who are receiving the prestigious Hendrickson Scholarship in Political Science and Honors. Please help me congratulate Emily Toms, Cole Peterson, Timothy Morgan, and this year's new scholarship recipient, Benjamin Connor, for their exceptional academic achievement. Ben joins us from Winford, South Dakota, and is a double major in political science and public relations. We wish them well in their studies. This lecture was created to elevate our understanding of and appreciation for the value of a liberal education. One reason why the liberal arts are so enriching is that they allow us to join a conversation that has been in progress literally for thousands of years. We have the opportunity to engage with some of the world's greatest thinkers. We can learn from them, draw inspiration from them, and even wrestle fiercely against some of them. Regardless, we grow as people by listening to and responding to a wide range of voices. We become better versions of ourselves by participating in this conversation. We live in a society that tends to value celebrity over substance. Our interactions with each other too often are reduced to an email, a Twitter exchange, an Instagram post, or a Facebook comment. Sometimes it seems as if we have forgotten how to listen respectfully and participate in an open exchange of ideas. But a solid foundation in the liberal arts teaches us that wisdom and an understanding of the human experience has no expiration date, nor does it belong to any one person, community, political party, nation, or society. We learn from those who came before us and work to blaze the trail for those who will follow us. Whether your intellectual heroes are Shakespeare and Cervantes, Emerson and Thoreau, or Angela Davis and Ta-Nehisi Coates, I encourage you to follow their example of a well-informed, creative, and thoughtful life. For the students in the audience, I want you to know that my faculty colleagues and I are all committed to your success. Our goal for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences is that every one of you will receive a rigorous and rewarding education, an education that allows you to follow your passions, engage in discovery and creativity, and that prepares you to choose professional and personal opportunities that will enrich your lives and the lives of others. I also want you to reflect on the conversation that you have joined. Your education doesn't end when you graduate. The conversation continues. I hope that you will keep participating throughout your entire life. I'm proud to work alongside colleagues like Dr. Freeland, who follow in the footsteps of Dr. Cheever and Dr. Hendrickson. They model lifelong learning and a lifetime commitment to truth and humane values. I hope you do the same. To commemorate this special event, we have commissioned a medallion to be presented each year to the faculty member who delivers this lecture. I have asked Dr. Christy Garce-Santos, Director of the School of American and Global Studies, to introduce our honored speaker and present the medallion.
Good evening. I am very pleased to have the privilege of introducing this year's J.P. Hendrickson Scholar and Cheever Lecturer, Dr. Mark Freeland. Dr. Freeland began his academic career at the University of Michigan, where he earned a BA in psychology. From there, he went on to study at the University of Denver's prestigious Iliff School of Theology, earning both a Master's of Divinity and a PhD in Religious and Theological Studies. After arriving at SDSU, Dr. Freeland quickly became an integral contributor to the American Indian Studies program, the American Indian Student Center, the Wokini Initiative, and the School of American and Global Studies. To highlight just a few of Dr. Freeland's contributions, under his leadership as coordinator of the American Indian Studies program, majors and minors have grown, and students routinely participate in hands-on research projects working with Oceti-Sakowee communities. Dr. Freeland also serves as the content expert for a university-wide Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies Grant, an award that seeks to fund educational programming for SDSU faculty, staff, and students. The grant team was awarded $1 million to fund these efforts over a 3-year period. Finally, Dr. Freeland has a new book coming out in 2021 with the prestigious Michigan State University Press titled Ajayadiji, Worldview, Language, and the Logics of Decolonization. In this groundbreaking work, Dr. Freeland draws on an impressive array of interdisciplinary sources, wrestles with big questions, and posits that we cannot begin the work of decolonization without coming to grips with the role of language, worldview, and the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples. Clearly, Dr. Freeland excels in our tripartite mission of teaching, service, and research, routinely illustrating the value of a liberal arts education. This value often lies not in the answers that we provide, but in the complex, critical questions that we pose. The liberal arts teach us to deal critically and logically with subjective and imperfect information. They teach us to weigh evidence skeptically and to consider more than one side to every question and more than one perspective to every issue. As a colleague and friend, I have witnessed Dr. Freeland ask difficult questions, offer diverse perspectives grounded in Indigenous knowledge, and have difficult yet compassionate conversations in his classroom, in his research, and in our interconnected communities. The lecture that he will present here tonight showcases the contributions of Indigenous intellectual traditions and the role those traditions play in asking difficult questions and providing valuable perspectives to the liberal arts tradition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Freeland to the stage. right. Here, can you bend and I will try and get it. There we go. Perfect. Welcome, the stage is yours.
Chingu thank you very much for those kind words, and we'll take a brief pause as we switch out kind of the rooms here. My colleagues were very gracious in allowing a viewing remotely in another room so that I can deliver this lecture maskless. As you know, so we've been indoors having to keep our mask on for a very, very long time, and it gets pretty challenging after you get past about 15, 20 minutes. So we'll make that shift. Bonjour, Noendigan, Makwandindodem, Makanakang Minwa Michigame and Donjiba, Bonjour, Narobasi Aking, Chimigwachinen. Bonjour, Noendigan, you are being thanked by me. Our bonjour is welcome and thank and hello, Noendigan, my relatives, and Makwandindodem, Bears, my clan, Makanakang, Turtles Back, and Michigame, the land of the Great Lakes, is where I'm from. Bonjour, also welcome, Narawasi King, Narawasi, the people of the Snake Lake River, and there's a number of rivers out this way, is another way of, in my own language, giving a land acknowledgement of the places that we're actually at. For Indigenous people, land and place provides a central negotiation for thought, particularly tied to worldview, when we think about how it is that we are related to one another and how it is that we are related to the land. Chimigwechinen, you're all being thanked by me for this honor. It is truly overwhelming to be picked for this negotiation, to be picked for this lecture, and to be able to deliver this set of knowledge that I work on with my own research, and to be welcome in this way. I begin this way not only as a means of introducing myself, which I rarely get the opportunity to do in a full kind of way, but also to begin a conversation about some fundamental truths about the diversity of languages that often gets overlooked in much of contemporary discourse. I'd like to thank the families of J.P. Hendrickson and Herbert Cheever for their contributions to make this night happen. It is an important endeavor to continue the work of these two faculty members and many others in promoting the liberal arts tradition. I'd also like to thank Dean Lynn Sargent and the offices of the Dean of the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences for putting all of this together. Particularly difficult times. We've had a number of meetings about how this is all going to take place. So I'm very, very, very thankful. And also give special thank you to Dr. Christy Guerra-Santos, not only for the wonderful introduction, but also to the rest of the colleagues in the School of American and Global Studies for making our stay and support here for myself and Dr. Charity Bassett, who I also get to be married to and teaches alongside me. Finally, I would like to give a special Chimigwechin, a big thanks to my family, without whose support I would not be able to be here. Tonight, in the absence of an audience, I get to give this lecture to my wife and best friend, Dr. Charity Bassett. I'm only able to be the scholar and person that I am because of the love, support, and intellectual challenge that she provides. I'm very thankful to my own family. My father is an educator. And this is certainly a culmination in a lot of different ways. It is truly an honor to be chosen to speak with you this evening. When I applied to and interviewed for this lecture, I had a very different conceptualization of what this would look like there would actually be people in the audience. But we kind of roll with the punches, and we're not going to sit back and wait. Knowledge isn't going to wait, so we have work to do. I would be remiss if I did not give brief mention what it really means to be an Indigenous person in this sort of environment. Indigenous people have had a very difficult relationship with education through colonization, including the use of education as a weapon against us in the form of boarding schools and forced assimilation through compulsory education. While we are not all safe from those negative effects, particularly the intergenerational trauma, we can mark the occasions where there are different negotiations with education for Indigenous people. It is an honor to work with a part of the Awokenee Initiative and taking seriously the greater inclusion of Indigenous students of Oceti-Sakowin and other peoples from this region. In particular, connecting the land to making greater opportunities for the original inhabitants of that land. Awokenee is writing a very different narrative of possibilities in education for Indigenous people. So, that being said, Sebuju, welcome to Dakota land. Welcome to Oceti-Sakowin land, the land of the original inhabitants. While inclusion is good, the challenge here at SDSU is the responsibility to make it a welcoming place for everyone. While inclusion, like I said, is good, we have to take seriously the role of Indigenous intellectual traditions. In Indigenous people, we have a millennia of experience in this land that we can share, and we have a lot to offer the intellectual debate on the most pressing of topics that face us. Tonight, I will share some of these experiences in the lecture titled An Indigenous Intervention, Methodology, Truth, and the Power of Community. So just with a couple of other preliminary remarks. In this lecture, I'll be discussing Indigenous intellectual traditions and the necessity for cultural adaptation. When we look around for positive role models for adaptation, our African American relatives are certain at the forefront of integration and leadership in social change. As a young person, I grew up in southern Anishinaabe in a small town called Chiasaning. It's more anglicized now to Chesaning. That's what you might find on a map. This is about 40 minutes from Flint, Michigan. And within radio distance of Hot 107.1, playing a very different music that I was accustomed to. And it was really mesmerizing. So really dating myself here with the bringing on of hip hop. But place is really, really important. Flint is a place where we quarried for stone tips for arrows for millennia. Flint is also one of our early characters of the Gijigoquai narratives, or Skywoman narratives, what is our origin in what is Mekanakong, the turtle on the turtle's back. Gijigoquai had a daughter, the lynx, and the lynx had two children, Sapling and Flint. Sapling is the firstborn son, and he came out in a good way for his mother. Flint, with his hard skin, came out of the side of his mother and killed her. In this narrative, we come to understand duality and help. Sometimes help comes in the form of making things easy, and sometimes it comes in the form of making things very difficult, but they are both understood as help. In Anishinaabe thought, we would say, we have a concept called Chittabenjigid, that which makes all things belong. And both things that are easy and things that are difficult are also welcomed. From Flint, in my lifetime, through the radio waves, I was introduced to music that was in itself an art form, an integrating experience, and would soon come to impress itself on the rest of the world and demand that it also be integrated there. When you think of being a good relative, and this is a very important Indigenous value, being a good relative, sometimes we just have to listen. Not to alter, not to combat, to dismiss, or otherwise explain away phenomenon like what has been happening this summer with racial injustice, and indeed what has been happening to black bodies for centuries. As a way of saying I'm listening, I'll use some sectional epigraphs from influential hip-hop artists that I'm familiar with. In this, I'm making no claim to be an expert, just someone who is listening. And the empowerment of people is an important endeavor, and education is certainly essential to that. And hip-hop has also been a very positive influence in that arena. So in this vein, from the airways, we get a number of different really important artists. And this empowerment is a really important factor. So from Run DMC, we can think about, from DMC we hear, my Adidas take a stand in a foreign land with my mic in hand, I took command. And it sounds way better from him. I did get a laugh, just so you know, by one audience, I got a laugh there, so that's always helpful. But this is the sort of empowerment that people take upon themselves, right? So as I enter the more formal part of the lecture, I'll continue a discussion of language. The Cheever lecture is the discussion of the importance of the liberal arts tradition, and I can begin with the definition of liberal as free and unrestricted. And this does come from Latin and has a long history been used to describe education in the liberal arts, again from Latin, and is an education at the time of the upper classes. Of course, at a land-grant school, this privilege of education has been opened up or liberalized, if you will. As part of that land-grant mission, we have education unrestricted, or at least less restricted in the Wilkini Initiative. Not only can we include more students in the empowerment of education, but also take this opportunity to take a much closer look at the role of Indigenous intellectual traditions in this place. Place, land, is of course the primary relationships for Indigenous people in ways that are challenging to translate into English. Tonight, from the vantage point of Indigenous lands and from these conceptualizations, we can return a narrative gaze from an Indigenous intellectual traditions onto the crisis of meaning and truth that we're currently dealing with. In this lecture, I'll provide 4 interrelated arcs, narrative arcs that will help to demonstrate, 1, the problem of truth and meaning-making has been a long-standing issue in many societies, and 2, that those problems have been embedded in liberal arts education and science itself. 3, that Indigenous knowledges have an effective negotiation of truth, something that we have to offer, and these methods have a lot to offer the critique in the current crisis of meaning. So when we think across time, we can really engage in a lot of thinkers, and that becomes a very, very important negotiation. So this first arc, I will demonstrate a long-standing tradition of liberal arts education in the West and develop an understanding of some of the problems associated with truth, power, community, and change. So here, Ibn Rushd is a 12th century Muslim philosopher who worked on the synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic scripture. He was born in Cordova, Spain in 1126 to an influential family and received an excellent education. Through his education contacts, he befriended influential philosophers and political leaders, and at the time was commissioned to provide commentaries and a rediscovery in the writings of Aristotle, among other Greek philosophers. And at this time, in North African, Iberian Muslim world was experiencing a shift towards Orthodox view of Islam. Theologians and their political leaders were growing suspicious of Greek influences and were beginning to publicly shun these philosophical nuances. However, privately, Rushd was still commissioned to write a series of treatises on Aristotelian philosophy. In this endeavor, Rushd developed 3 methods of finding truth. They are rhetorical, dialectical, and demonstrative. The rhetorical method is a singular person making an argument and correlates to the truth of the common masses of people for Rushd. And dialectical truth is derived from the debate between two people and associated with theologians, and this is a common form of discourse for theologians at the time. Rushd emphasizes the role of the philosopher, a little bit biased himself, but that's understandable, that he promoted the idea of demonstrative truth that philosophy provides, a complex argumentation synthesizing different types of source materials. And ultimately for Rushd, philosophy was compatible with scripture and truth. Islam, of course, is the ultimate truth for Muslim people, and philosophy is a search for truth. If there becomes conflict between the two truths, then scripture can be interpreted allegorically. Allegory, according to Rushd, had already been accepted by theologians and philosophers and Muslims alike. The only disagreement among Muslims is the extent of its use. One of these tests for truth had to do with the power of community. If there is a consensus about a particular meaning of a text, either allegorical or apparent, then the meaning is not up for debate. If, however, there is no consensus, then the meaning is not up for debate, is then free for interpretation. The community has the power to decide how a passage is to be read and ultimately where truth lies and how it is found. This tension between a liberal or conservative reading of Islamic texts was not just being played out among the debates and the philosophers in their writings, but also in the courts of powerful families and their rule. With a growing shift towards orthodox views and the associated community consensus at the same direction, Rush was exiled from Cordova for his views and his books were burned. He was able to return 2 years later, but within a year had died. And this is, if we talk about a relationship to more contemporary, what we think of as Western thought, this is a full 100 years prior to Thomas Aquinas attempting similar negotiations with Aristotelian philosophy in Christian communities. What we see in this episode of Iberian synthesis and philosophy might help highlight some of the continual problems in human communities. There is no such thing as a static culture. There are always influences, there are always contacts, always relationships to be worked out. So the question becomes, how do we negotiate change? This question is challenging to answer and begs a complex, demonstrative negotiation of related information. How is power manifest in the community? And how do we think of change? One of the primary benefits of a liberal arts education is evident here, and that is the power of the question. Liberal arts traditions, at its best, is not about reproducing systems of power, but about responding to the reality of dynamic change. To set off this second arc, the second narrative arc, this is MC Breed. He's actually from Flint, Michigan. And he had a hit song, Ain't No Future in Your Frontin'. And for those of you that might not be understood the lingo, that frontin' is to put up a facade or make appearances, typically to impress or deceive to maintain image. Again, it sounds way better coming from him, but it is something to think about, that there's no future in the facade. You better come with some real stuff. In the second arc, we'll continue the discussion of power and its potential corrupting influences on knowledge and truth. And this arc follows a rising conflict between science and religion as an explanatory system for the cosmos, and maybe more importantly, about the logics embedded in the search for truth. Here I'll begin to provide a basis for indigenous intervention with a discussion of worldview and the logics associated with the base relationships to land, time, and life. If we are to participate in this analysis entirely from a Euro-Western perspective, which is what most of us are doing, then if we discuss a conflict between science and religion, it would be easy to focus on the differences between the two systems of thought. And indeed, there certainly are a number of differences. However, if one, let's say an indigenous person, comes to this debate, we can provide a different perspective which demonstrates that while science and religion come to different answers in some cases, they're slightly different answers to the same questions. Embedded in these questions are the logics of culture, for both science and religion are remarkably similar. One of the issues of using a concept like worldview is that it is not in agreement with what it actually means. Worldview can range from a deep-seated conceptualization of culture to individuals' view of the world. With such a range of meaning, the concept is useless for analysis unless given a clear definition. Here I privilege a definition that provides an understanding for cultural difference. In my research, I've come to use a definition of worldview as an interrelated set of cultural logics that prescribe fundamental relationships to land, time, life, and a methodological lens to structure those relationships to life. Very theoretical. Now we move into some of the more concrete understandings. it's important to make a few brief remarks about what worldview is and what worldview is not. A worldview is a communal, unconscious, organized, cumulative formulation of a cultural reality. And that way, then, having an individual having a worldview is ridiculous in this definition. You can have a view of the world, but that's not a worldview. We are born into socio-political, cultural realities already in existence, held together with our own linguistic conceptual systems, narratives, and institutional realities. A worldview is not an ideology. Ideologies are consciously constructed and maintained. When we apply this definition understanding to the debate between science and religion, then an indigenous critique can provide a deeper understanding of some of the problems involved. When we look at science and religion from this perspective, we can see at the level of worldview, they are remarkably similar. Both relate to land in the form of dominion. In the religious sense, it is given to humans to control, and in science, nature is the object to the study of the subject. When we think of manifestation of science in the service of industry, then dominion can be understood as an accurate definition. Time is understood in both places as linear progression. So we have the sin, salvation, eschaton trajectory from religion and narratives of evolution in science. Both run a linear trajectory. In relationship to life, both religion and science order life as a hierarchy. For religion, you have God, church, priests, lay people, heathen, sinners, hell. Or at least in the early formulations, science does the same thing. So we have hierarchies in the Lamarckian sense, with a hierarchy of complexity, or in a Darwinian sense, in a hierarchy of fitness. These, of course, are manifested in a number of different ways that naturalize hierarchy, with that up-down image schema. So we have this ongoing up-down negotiation of the way conceptualization that life has. These are naturalized in the form of corporate structure or in a more sinister racialized gendered hierarchies as well. And finally, we can think of a methodological lens of conceptualizing relationships as functioning around Manichaean dualisms of good and evil. This is manifest in the ordering of relationships to others, for example. Indigenous people becoming the red devils and constant threat to the colony. At this point, the analysis, we can speak of growing dissonance or duality in scientific methodology in negotiating life. And we can kind of put an asterisk here, because I'm going to come back to this, because I'm sure some of you are thinking that that's not the science I understood. But we think about the origins coming out of the 19th century, this is their role, like this is the reality coming out. When we think of contemporary of environmental science, ecology, and others in particular, there certainly is a movement away from these monotheistic logics, or a one universal way of being, to understandings of complex systems striving towards balance. It is in these shifts of thought that we can find exciting new eras, overlapping ideas. So just a brief note, when I talk about monotheistic logics, there is a mathematical logic in numbers. So if coming from monotheism, if there can only be one, per se, a one universal God, one universal way of understanding the world, when that system of thought comes up and meets something else in relationship, then decisions have to be made. Then the idea of oneness can be shifted, or you can try to overpower, destroy the other, so you're still the only one. All right, what that leads to is that Manichaeanism, that good-evil split, which then justifies that sort of conflict as, again, no culture is going to stay static or only in and of itself. We're always in a relationship to other things. All right, so when I make that, I'm not saying that monotheism is bad in and of itself, but the logics that come from oneness create certain problems. and that's a very different argument. Indigenous worldviews function quite differently. If we use the above definition, and before I go to there, that was always fun with bumper stickers. As a brief examination of this kind of contemporary conflict between science and religion, while this is one kind of funny way to talk about it, like, the little fish on the back of people's cars, that certainly, whether it's the Christian fish or in various models or the Darwinian notion, right? There's just little battles and these little conflicts that happen, Keep waiting for the best one to come out and to win the argument, I don't know exactly if that's going to work out. Go ahead, you can laugh out loud, Gigi. It's okay. This is where I cross my fingers and I hope other people get the jokes. Never know without immediate feedback. All right. When we bring in Indigenous worldview, what we can see is a much deeper negotiation of cultural difference. So in Indigenous worldview, when we relate to land, there's an intimate relationship to a localized space. And again, that's different in Euro-Western worldview as dominion. Time is cyclical, and rather than linear, that we live in a large web of relatedness, and that is that there is these very complex systems of relationships that we live in that are laterally conceptualized. So while there are some things above and below, our primary relationships are all around us. And this methodological lens we understand as balance, that the ways in which we're supposed to be thinking about and achieving in these sets of relationship is a balance between multiple complex systems. So a couple of concrete examples to help try to elucidate some of this. I started with Flint and Chiasaning for a very particular reason. Like my relationship to land, I don't know how should I say this? There's a cultural embeddedness in naming where you're from and what your relationships are to specific places. And it goes to a linguistic conceptual system. So like in my language, I can't even say just I am or to be. I have to say exactly where I'm located. And that's a worldview, right? So if the language structures the thought and it is manifest in particular ways, that is where we think about this as not just an idea, but a deeply embedded worldview. Time is being cyclical, of course, as related to moon cycles, into solar cycles, into star knowledge. And it is these sort of phenomenon that we pay attention to that decides that it is a cyclical understanding. It is that cyclical thought, the 28-day cycle of the moon and the daily Gizig cycle of the Gizis, the sun, and the star knowledge, of course, that we have, as well as there's the two-part piece of Gizis, the sun, as the daily cycle and the yearly cycle. So when you're negotiating these, and there's no counting involved, so that represents a cycle, and that these paying attention to, let's say, the moon phases from full to new and back to full, those are recurring events. They are not markings of a continual time frame. The primary negotiation is your land, that intimate relationship to the center of your culture and your place. And that never shifts, right? Only in extreme, cataclysmic problems, when huge geological problems of phase, tidal wave tsunamis and stuff, that's the only time people ever move, not when you have, you don't just move for the heck of it. But this demonstrates that kind of groundedness in that worldview and understanding, and that is particularly important to pay attention to. And when we put these things side by side with the Euro-Western thought, it's not a way of saying one's better than the other. I'm not trying to buy into a Manichaean logic here. I'm just saying that there are different ways of understanding the world. And when we understand those sort of differences, we may have some other things to say regarding these logics and how we play out and negotiate relationships. Finally, this lens of balance is important to pay attention to as we share this huge sets of life, this web of relatedness, right? So these are understood in kinship terms. So the sun is Niseye, it is older brother. Moon is Nokomis, moon is grandmother. Earth is Matakomakwe, it is earth mother. And all of our relations around us are understood in those sort of familial relationships. Older brother, younger sibling, Nishime, those are ways in which that we think about them. And that provides some ethical background into how it is that we're going to construct, conceptualize, and participate in those relationships. And that comes into play when we're really looking at how to make a living. So if you're picking medicines, if you're picking food, if you're hunting, that is a type of violence against living things, right? So that's where the ceremony comes in, when we offer those, those little bits of tobacco, and when we communicate with those relatives about what we're going to be doing with them. It's not some sort of picking in vain, we're not destroying anything. It's about we're going to use them to feed our families. And that becomes a very different negotiation, and it's embedded in those logics of kinship relationships with the rest of the world. And that is really, really important to understand. So with this knowledge of logics, with this knowledge of worldview, if we can kind of come back to this negotiation of science versus religion, right? So in some ways, it gets played out over and over again. Not just in bumper stickers, but in, sometimes geopolitical relationships. And when we think about those roles in power, right, we're supposed to think of science as this kind of purely objective negotiation. But what really happens during this period of time is that rather than coming to a different way of understanding the world, science really just as a ideology takes over the helm and tries to run things from a singular logic itself, right? It becomes the one universal. It becomes the godlike objectivity. And in that negotiation, it kind of then, in relationship to indigenous people, loses its bearing. And there's a number of examples of the ways in which the knowledge, or the so-called knowledge through the education system, at the same time justifying the boarding school processes, comes to do all sorts of violence, not only to indigenous people, but also to its own methodology, right? It completely jettisons any sort of integrity in proof and development of evidence. And we have a couple of examples that we can talk about, just to briefly give that sort of narrative. And this is an important thing to think about when indigenous people are invited into educational systems. Like, these are institutions that were used against us, right? And now we're happy to come through and be part of this. But it's important to come to grips about those sort of violences that have taken place. So to give a couple understandings of the scientific thought, which is both through liberal arts and hard sciences, we're going to talk about the work of Hendrickson Jr. briefly. And then to set that off, we're going to talk about Eric B. and Rakim in the song Microphone Fiend. Says, I'm going to be an EFFECT, a smooth operator operating correctly. And in that role, we think about Deloria and him really setting a path early on. So this is in the late 1960s, early 1970s, of kind of one of very, very few indigenous scholars taking these things to task. And the question he keeps coming up with is, where's the evidence? You keep saying these things, where's the evidence? So we talked briefly about the Bering Strait land bridge theory, and this is still being taught in K through 12, in some cases being taught in universities. Where's the evidence? If we think about this negotiation of what this actually means, that a group of people leave East Asia, there must have been an impetus to people, no one's going to migrate just because, right? Then they're going to cross gigantic mountain ranges, then a icy land bridge with almost no food on it, then another mountain range, and then make a sprint down this crack in the glacier, all to corroborate archaeological findings of indigenous people with new, very recent archaeological evidence. So within this 10 to 13,000 years ago time frame. when we think about this realistically, it's like, well, that's a pretty fantastic story. You better come with some evidence. When Deloria looks into this, there isn't any. It's just a narrative that gets made up, right? Even the people that are supposed to be like the deans of the system of thought, even in books that have names like the Bering Land Bridge, edited by David Hopkins, the person who's heading us out with William Laughlin, just barely tells sparse passages of any sort of narrative, right? Deloria looks into this, and the people in this paleo, Pleistocene time frame, 13,000 years ago, were doing just fine in East Asia. There's no impetus to leave. There's plenty of food in that area for them, right? Right. So then why would people go on this path? And of course, the reality is they didn't. So what's going on with this mind frame that people are just going to jettison this idea of evidence, who are scientists, and then just make up the story, right? Another one we can talk about is this mythical, and this is Deloria's just genius, right? If I can write half as good as him as far as chapter titles, I'm going to be doing something. He talks about mythical Pleistocene hitmen. So the narrative goes that as these Paleo Indians come across this land bridge and sprint their way down into the grasslands of North America, the first thing they do, well, what are we going to do here? Like, well, let's kill everything, so let's go hunt everything to extinction. Now the reality is there is a mass extinction of the megaflora and fauna during the Pleistocene era, but no one hunted them to extinction. And again, think about this, you're going to use stone-tipped tools, bows and arrows and spears. You're going to take down a woolly mammoth? Come on. There's all sorts of other easier game to go get, and you're going to take down this gigantic elephant-like animal. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So we really have to ask some really hard questions here. What are we doing, So with the mythical Pleistocene hitmen, Deloria went back and forth with Paul Martin a number of different times on this theory of Pleistocene extinction. And he kept saying, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And then eventually Donald Grayson at the University of Washington in the 90s, I believe, does a thorough search. And there's 3 sites in all of North America which even demonstrate some sort of evidence and contact between the megafauna and what are then indigenous people. Right? This is not exactly overwhelming evidence. So again, what is going on here? And during this period, there's a numerous ways in which that just narratives are being made up about indigenous people. And they're hyper engaged in political philosophies that place us here. So that if we think about it, if indigenous people are newcomers to the land here too, that helps to assuage the guilt and the problems of colonization, right? If you're newcomers and we're newcomers and no one has a real kind of settled title to the land, and it's okay that we come over and take it over. If you're hunters and gatherers, which most of us were agricultural people, had huge farms, if you're hunters and gatherers, that justifies our taking over the land, right? And that's legally codified in Johnson v. McIntosh, Doctrine and Discovery. If you came over and destroyed everybody, all this megaflora and fauna, then you must not have been that great a people, and we have to really take note of this sort of work, and it's really a problem. So an indigenous way of thinking about this, we have to really ask, what is the evidence? And this is where we have a lot in common with liberal arts and harder scientific thought. Is we're hyper-empirical communities. We have to have some sort of experience, what is the evidence? You better be able to come with it if you're going to talk about it, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about truth here in a minute and the importance of that. A third narrative arc I want to pay attention to is pretty short, but talks about postmodernism in the work of Francois Leotard. So Leotard is a postmodern thinker out of France, and his work helps to demonstrate that this larger current of postmodernism really comes down to trying to understand systems of power and upend them, right? So postmodernism as a whole is concerned with the role of power as manifest in language, society, and institutions. And this discourse takes flight post-World War II Europe in reaction to the horrors of that war, right? So people watching this promise of scientific positivism and technology during the previous century get used for the purpose of mass extinction and that brutality of the war-making machines. It had a real significant impact on people who were going through that. And what Leotard does is this analysis about power. Right? And even on in the early scientific endeavor, power in the form of wealth helped to drive some scientific investigation. Astronomers needed to buy lenses to build telescopes. The new chemistry required use of expensive glass beakers, to name a couple of examples. And scientists, not necessarily a part of a formal education system, sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't, had to rely on benefactors to purchase these necessary tools. And there's this long trajectory of the need of money and capital to fund research, right? So we fast forward to contemporary times. Funds are even more necessary to carry out research. As Leotard discusses, a new problem appears. Devices that optimize the performance of the human body for the purposes of producing proof require additional expenditures. No money, no proof. And that means no verification of statements and no truth. The games of scientific language become the games of the rich, in which whoever is the wealthiest and best have the best chance of being right. An equation between wealth, efficiency, and truth is thus established. And while this is certainly a pretty pessimistic view in the endeavor of truth, before we work to discount the idea, I would suggest that we should at least listen. While I don't agree that all truth is bought and sold like a commodity, there certainly are areas where the investments are needed to provide proof for the establishment of truth, and they come from significant wealth. From some areas in philosophy and indigenous intellectual traditions, we have a lot of ethical questions to ask. Are these really donations, or are there strings attached? What is the difference between philanthropy, governmental grants, and corporate foundations? What are the parameters for study? Do I have to fit my research questions into a box that can be funded more easily, or am I free to pursue truth in the ways in which my scholarship and experiences find life-giving? How free and liberal are these researchers able to get to the attainment of truth? And these are just some important questions to pose, particularly in our current situation. But finally, I do want to spend the rest of the time elaborating on some more indigenous intervention in this notion of truth in my own community. So in Anishinaabemowin, the closest concept that we have is debwe. And I have to make a number of comments to help translate what it is that we're really doing with this concept, because it is not a one-to-one translation by any means. So one glaring difference is that debwe is a verb. And one of the challenges in translating indigenous languages is that often 2/3 of our words are verbs. In this contrast to Romance languages, which are largely noun-based. Noun-based languages are good at identifying and naming things, but not as good in action. And dynamic action and change is where indigenous languages thrive. So debwe is not truth in the noun sense. Is not that which is in accordance with fact reality in the same way. It is in the telling of truth or communicating of something that is in accordance with reality. However, I have to go deeper as well, because in Anishinaabe and other indigenous cultures, there is no requirement of belief in a particular cultural truth to belong to a community. There are no "do you believe in God or evolution" questions parsing out believers from non-believers. Citizenship is entirely based on kinship and the responsibility to participate in the flourishing of the community. So one more time, citizenship is entirely based in kinship and the responsibility to participate in the flourishing of the community. While many people believe similarly, the particulars of those beliefs vary depending on experience. There is no monotheistic logic as a driving force, no need to come to a universal agreement. So while some people have a life-changing experience, say during a ceremony like Gi Goshimo or fasting for a vision, others do not. With that example, there's a large range of understandings of what it means to have a vision. But it also must be noted that since debwe corresponds to the telling of truth, then embedded in the concept is a relational value. Someone is communicating truth to somebody else or to a group of people. This relational quality provides the basis for the high value and responsibility for telling the truth. In Anishinaabe and other indigenous cultures, telling truth is of the highest value because the flourishing of the community is dependent upon it. It is so important in some instances that people could be killed for lying. For example, if someone claimed to have medicinal abilities but was unable to manifest those abilities in ceremony, then they would be putting the community at risk. Someone who would rely on that person for healing could die. And while it is rare, it is known to happen. Debwe, as a relational and experiential concept, is never tied to an overarching meta-reality that we are somehow required to be coerced to believe in. If we would say, Nin Debwe, I am telling the truth, what is being said is agreed to what is being agreed to is understood to be only an honest account of what that person has experienced. Invoking some sort of meta-truth as truth with a capital T is no longer about which is in accordance with fact or reality. It is more about power and the attempt to bring people under a singular ideological umbrella. There is no truth, capital T, equivalent in indigenous cultures. That concept just doesn't exist. So if we think about methods of engaging this sort of truth-telling, we can include ceremonial and outward signs used to emphasize or ensure truth-telling for the sake of community. Much has been misunderstood about the role of pipes. And just as a side note, I made a conscious choice not to put a picture up. That's not to say that we can't per se, but there's been so much used and abused, and some of the pictures, like you don't know whose pipe it is. There often pipes are put together, which is a no-no unless you're actually using them. There's a lot of protocols around it, and pipes are really, really important, so it's not something that we should really take lightly. First, a couple of brief comments. It is not a peace pipe, though it is often used in treaty making. That's not what we call them, and you shouldn't either. Tobacco used ranges from actual tobacco plants in Nicotina rustica, or more often the inner tree bark of some trees like a red willow, or a mix of the two things. It is never used to smoke any drugs or otherwise come to a mind-altering experience. That is never the case. While the pipe is used in a wide range of situations and ceremonies, it is primarily a communication device. It helps to carry thoughts and ideas to our relatives. For the discussion, pipe is often associated with communicating news or in negotiating treaties. In this way, the smoking of a pipe is used to call the people present to one heart and one mind, and to remind them to think of all of their relatives as they come to communicate for a specific purpose. The pipe used in this way is a method of providing a period of contemplation on the importance of speech before one speaks to others. And that's primarily what we want to think about. It is used as a means of providing a contemplative rest to really think about what it is that you're going to say. Like other cultural items, eagle feathers are also used in a variety of ways, and one of them is to indicate debwe. Certainly less formal than a pipe ceremony, speaking with an eagle feather in your hand indicates to those present that what you're saying is important, and you're emphasizing both that importance and your honesty in that process. As a brief exercise, for a minute, think about these sort of methods of truth-telling for debwe and think about their application in a different social realm. Just think for a second, what might social media or Twitter look like? If that before you're going to hit send, that you had to take at least 5 minutes, maybe more, maybe a little bit less, to think about what it is that you're going to say. Like, is this something that's going to bring a life-giving situation to other people? Does this really need to be said? One thing I'm very thankful to be able to teach so many Indigenous students here is that many of our Indigenous students are very good at listening, right? Now, it's hard to tell. Sometimes it might mean that they're not really paying attention like every other student. However, there is a cultural value that is evident in a room full of Indigenous students who aren't so quick to try to come to some sort of snap judgment and are taking their words very carefully. And that is something that I know that many of them are learning back home. And that's great to see. There are also some non-Indigenous students doing the same thing. It's just important to pay attention to what that value is when we take our words very seriously. So when we come down towards conclusions, I choose to follow a more Indigenous way of negotiating them. Coming down too much and to tell you exactly all of the conclusions is a very non-Indigenous way of negotiating things. When people are speaking in the Indigenous world, it is up to you and everybody else to come up with your own conclusions. And that is not... What's being engaged there is a responsibility, and it's a responsibility in community and that power in community that we have to engage in a discourse. We have to engage each other, preferably face to face, but maybe with masks right now. Like we'll get back to that. Like this is not our forever. This is just our right now. But to be in those spaces with one another and to hold difficult questions and to do our best to negotiate that is really, really important. And while it can be scary, I think, to think about social change, it is just a fundamental reality. To really think about this, again, back to Run DMC, and you got Jam Master Jay kicking out that sound. The turntable might wobble, but it won't fall down. You know, that negotiation of it's not going to fall down, like how do we keep in contact with our communities? For us as Indigenous people, I'll speak very specifically, our challenge is to hold on to those relationships to our ancestors, to hold on to those relationships to our land, and to listen to our elders as best we can, and to relearn our languages in many cases was a big challenge that we have right now. So that in future generations, they too are going to be able to stay connected to the ancestors, and that they're going to stay connected to the language and the land. When we think about this role of education, I would have to say that that's probably something that I just explained that many people have on their mind. And who your ancestors are and where those lands are might be a little bit different. But those concerns are certainly there, that we have responsibilities to carry on those traditions, but we only really have to carry them on if they're life-giving. And this is where some of the difficulty happens. How are we going to choose? How do we figure this out? And it's certainly not going to be shouting it past each other, and it's not going to be all decided with a clever tweet or whatever, right? It's going to be in spaces like this that we hold challenging thought over and over again, that we listen to people like Ibn Rushd, right? Believe how you will about what you actually should do for religion, right? But trying to synthesize and integrate other thought is a very, very useful phenomenon. And to find not just where science and technology has done us benefits, and it certainly has, but where has it gone awry? Like, let's have that conversation too. Because for us as Indigenous people, it has gone really, really poorly, and in some cases still does. Like, let's have that conversation to figure out how to do that better, so like how to stop those things. There's a lot to learn in a liberal arts education. We have a lot to offer in the School of Global and American and Global Studies. But together as communities, we have the power to decide. There is a reality there, and it's certainly based into socio-political systems that we live in, And that is very similar to indigenous communities who are some of the basis, particularly Haudenosaunee confederacies, for what it becomes American democracy. Like, we're very practiced in these understandings of democratic thought and freedom and how to hold tension with communities who don't necessarily all believe the same. And it's important just to come to the reality that synthesizing knowledge requires that possibility of change. Ultimately, worldview matters, and the narratives prescribe parameters of thought, like those logics we have to really pay close attention to. And at this point, I would like to invite folks to come back in. We'll go ahead and mask up, and please do ask questions. I really, really thoroughly enjoy this part of things. This is the fun part. Like, I mean, this rhetorical, if we were going to follow Rush, right? This has been the rhetorical piece of me talking to you, which I'm thankful. But, you know, if we can engage in a much more complex and a thorough discourse with everybody, I certainly look forward to your questions. So we'll take a brief minute as we get these up. Chikamungwachinen, you are being thanked by me. And now I got to put my mask on. Where'd I put it?
For sharing your scholarship with us this evening. It's truly an honor to be your colleague. We do want to give everyone a chance to ask questions regarding the lecture. If you have a question, please follow the instructions on the screen and go to menti.com and use the code 2942026. You know how to use this. You may have to do all the questions.
I think there's a joke in here about how many PhDs does it take to run a new app?
I think you're probably right. I think there's a definite joke there. How many PhDs does it take to run a new app? So,
Any all have a question?
are we up and running? Are there any questions from our live audience while we wait for our technology?
Yes, please. How should non-Indigenous people support this important work? How can non-Indigenous people be allies for seeing and speaking truth in this way?
It's always, it's a question we get quite a bit, and it's a great question. You know, I really think going to places where, and I like to say in my class, there's Indian people doing Indian things, is kind of a fun way of thinking, and go to places where people are engaging, and show up and listen for a while. I would like to really encourage anyone to take an AIS class who's here. Like, there are many, many entry points with which to kind of get your feet wet to figure out how it is that you can understand, cross-pollinate, and negotiate. I would say half of our minors in AIS are non-Indigenous. It is for everyone, right? And that's really, really important. You know, in the American Indian Student Center here, we have many different programs that are for everybody. Show up, come engage, and challenge yourself. And you're going to be a little vulnerable, and that's okay, right? I can assure you that all the Indigenous people coming here are very, very vulnerable, you know, and we all are at some point, right? You know, so I think to really find ways to ally, that one gets a little trickier. I think you really have to be invited, right? If you're going to work with Indigenous people, there's going to be an invitation, and you kind of got to show up and wait for an invitation, because we've had so many people who come to us, who come to our communities over and over again, who want to do good, but you can't just show up and swoop in, do a couple of things, and swoop on out and be okay. Like, that's just not how this works. So the question of allyship, I think, is you have to be really patient. Be patient and let those relationships develop. Is kind of the short version.
So we have another question here. Dr. Freeland, in your experience, is the divide in worldviews within our society broadening or decreasing?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I've ever been asked that question before. I would say in the example of scientific thought, there is the combination, and as I began to talk about some of this dissonance within Euro-Western thought around particular science in ecology, environmental science, and how understandings of relationships in nature. In that sense, I think if we follow those trajectories, there is a lot more commonalities that we can work on. To say that the worldview is necessarily changing or shifting, those things change over centuries, not necessarily over like even a lifetime, right? We can change ideas, and you know, we could work really hard and over a lifetime change ideologies, but what worldview is, that kind of like embedded in linguistic structure, doesn't change so quickly. I think that we can set up close, how should I say this? We can really work on those problems to push that down the road, but these are really intergenerational issues around worldview. I think that in other areas, some people have really doubled down on monotheistic logic was one true way of being in the world, and that's it, you know. And in that sense, you know, I wouldn't say it's moved necessarily further apart, but that's just kind of reinscribing that kind of the ongoing negotiation of oneness, which it just isn't a very good understanding of reality when we think of a totality of all peoples and life.
So this person says, thank you so much for your talk. Can you tell us a bit more about using Indigenous methods or understanding in the classroom? Either how you use it or take advantage of it, or how others might use it.
Pretty broad. I think it's a good question. In the classroom, as much as you can bring in Indigenous scholars and Indigenous thought is really, really important. And there are many different scholarly disciplines. I think in the classroom, I should really be talking to Dr. Bassett on this. This is Dr. Bassett's forte, if you will. But, you know, kind of if we're talking about like teaching methodology, you know, you could talk about the role of, it's okay to repeat things that are important. Really the use of narrative is really, really important. We, in pretty much all of our classes, teach one novel because scientific knowledge and data and charts do a good job of making an argument, but they don't make people care at all, or very rarely. Literature makes people care, because if you get into a character, like we can see this, there's a stark difference when we talk about kind of our usual journal knowledge and then, you know, using a Louise Erdrich novel. The shift in the students is palpable. So I think those are very, very good negotiations of this kind of Indigenous thought, and just to think about these concepts and what Indigenous people are working on.
Dr. Freeland, how do Indigenous people connect with the land in the modern world?
Shimigwechin for your thoughtful questions. How do you connect the land in the modern world? There's a big range, you know, it depends. For folks that live in some areas very close to the land still, not much has changed. It depends, you know, some things have shifted. You know, I'll use myself for an example. You know, so growing up in the Great Lakes, our reservations are very small, and this land base doesn't function in the same way. So I still grew up in Anishinaabe, Yakin, and like I said, Chiasaning. And so I grew up on the river, and we played, and while I didn't live right on it, you know, we always were in canoes, and we're always fishing, because fishing obviously is a big deal when you're up in the Great Lakes. And you're still going to engage in that direct contact as best that you can. Being that so many of us live in like some level of diaspora, what it means to go back to your homeland might be a little bit different depending on where you're from. You know, from the Common Read book right now, Tommy Orange, There, in the end of the prologue, he finishes with something like, land is either everywhere or it's nowhere, which is a very, very useful way of thinking about this. Like, you either have land everywhere, like in Oakland, California, and people are going to go there, you know, in these, what's the not termination, but relocation efforts. There's still land base there. It's shifted, it's changed, it's got cement on it, you know, it's got canals, but it's still land. Like, you either have a conceptualization of land or you do not. So in that urban setting, it has shifted quite a bit, and it's very, very challenging. When I lived in Denver for 13 years, we had a community center downtown, so engaging in that way was still very useful with each other. But we also had ceremonial grounds south of town, and we had to drive 45 minutes. Unfortunately, folks who didn't have a vehicle, we were always giving rides, you know, to go down in my language, you talk about a Madutsuwan Purification Lodge, and out here in Oceti language, you talk about Inipi. It was commonly misunderstood as a sweat lodge. And while you do sweat, that's not necessarily the primary negotiation. Like, purification is how those names actually translate. So there's many different ways, and it is certainly altered. But those are some kind of brief pieces here, and that's an ongoing issue.
Hi, Mark. Can you speak to any efforts you or others at SDSU are working on to introduce Indigenous worldviews to some of our disciplines, particularly the sciences?
The question was invented in a lab for me. So a couple different things. So with the Margaret A. Cargill grant, you know, we will be doing trainings all over, and so there's some base pieces that we'll be negotiating from there, and that's for everybody. When we think about, you know, really engaging at a deep level of worldview, so I have some modest grant monies to start an indigenous farming initiative, and to be able to do research on those pieces, and I'm working with other folks in natural resource management to really elaborate on that, and I think really the sky's the limit in negotiating that. So I really look forward to developing more relationships. I mean, we're already with folks with Maderi, with Macquarie Gardens, to do an indigenous showpiece there, but to really think through what it means to be in relationship and to show people, like, you know, talking about it is great, but we need to really get our hands dirty in the soil in a number of different ways and to negotiate those things. So, you know, we've done regenerative agriculture for millennia, you know, and understand the importance of keeping soil in a good, healthy state. We've been doing these things for a very, very long time. And it might not always look like, you know, industrialized, mechanized farming that we have now. But folks out here, even, you know, the so-called hunters and gatherers, you know, they know where their turnip patches are, they know where their chokecherry bushes are, and they're cultivated year after year. For us, you know, our gardens may have been modest, you know, living way up in northern Michigan with the growing season is not particularly great. But when you do controlled burns and open up those meadows and keep blueberries, like, that's very intentional. It's not like we happened upon it. It's like, oh, I dropped fire. You know, we have very good knowledges of these things, and I'm very happy to be able to engage in some of those pieces. And if there's any professors watching, I am, you know, happy to sit in on classes and to give lectures and to kind of get those base understandings out there. I mean, that is what we do. So there's those kind of pieces that we're going to have quite a bit more. I mean, there's the WISIPAM program that's been starting up. That's another engagement there. And certainly in extension, there are folks in extension doing some pretty exciting work as well.
Okay, see if I can unloose the question. That's not the one. Okay. Dr. Freeland, do you have a favorite narrative? And if so, in what way does it speak to your own idea of worldview?
It's like asking, you know, what's your favorite song? Like, that's going to shift a little bit. But you know, studying narratives and to really think about, when I say narratives, particularly I'm talking about origin narratives and these kind of ancestral narratives. And, you know, in my language, we have two types. We have Atazukanag and Debajimoan. So Atazukanag are actually the same name for the ancestors themselves and the narratives of the ancestors. And linguistically within my language, they're considered alive. They're given kind of a denotion of living or power. And, you know, coming into, like, literally the first snowfall, like, and for us, Bebon is this winter time is about purification. And this is when we tell stories. So we're kind of gearing up into that. And there's actually protocols about not telling any Atazukanag outside of literally when the frogs go under the mud and when they come out of the mud is linguistically how it works, but essentially when the snow flies. So as soon as it starts snowing, then I can actually start sharing things. Now, sadly, I'm not like the same storyteller. Like, I'm not given that sort of permission to go full out, but talking about Gijigokwe and Sky Woman, I think, is just incredibly important, and what those origin narratives are. Because those narratives set base logics for us to understand how to engage in the world. You know, so if, you know, for us, our first human type person was female, that's important to pay attention to, and comes through the hole in the sky, which is the Pleiades, and comes down to a water world, and their world's already in existence. Like, there's no, so when we think about this, you know, as a, you know, religious and theological studies nerd, there's no ex nihilo creation. There is no creation out of nothingness. We don't have to deal with that problem. Sky Woman comes down into a world already in existence. And the water world is there, and the animals, see her and they're like, okay, we better do something. There's this woman falling from the sky, we got to do something, so they, catch her in their wings and bring her down to the turtle's back, and that's how life is molded again. And I say molded, not created, because we don't have ex nihilo creation. Like, that idea of create is embedded in that doctrinal heritage. We don't have creation in the same way. The land was reworked. There's always a starting place that's embedded with the materials already in existence. And that's a pretty common indigenous phenomenon for our origin narratives. So it's about reworking, it's about restarting, it's about reproducing. And there's all sorts of those engagements. I talked about Flint, like, these narratives are so important. And our young people really, really should know them. And I think everybody should at some level, at least to engage. I think it would be great. What we see with Flint and sapling gets translated into good and evil. That's not it. It's about, you get help that things are good, and you get help when things are bad. So sapling, as they're molding the land, sapling makes rivers that flow in both directions. So you can ride a canoe both directions nice and easy. And Flint's like, no, we're not doing that. Like, you're going to get one easy route, and you got to get one hard on the way back, and everything's flat with sapling, and Flint comes in and is like, no, wow, like, we got valleys and mountains, you got to go easy downhill, but you can go hard uphill. That sort of duality is really, really important to understand, that not all help is going to be making things easier. I mean, I tell that of our students particularly with new students that are freshmen, like, education's supposed to be hard. Like, if it was easy, you wouldn't really get a whole lot out of it. Like, let's be honest about that. Like, it's supposed to be challenging in very, very good ways. And yeah, you're going to get mad and frustrated and throw your books or something, or maybe that's just me when I was an undergrad. But that we have that we're supposed to be challenging. Like, that's when it's hard, it's working good, right? It shouldn't be impossible, but that's going to be challenging. And I think that's the narratives that we come out. If you have Flint and sapling in your head already, coming to challenges, you can come with a little bit different understanding of logic and what it is that you can do in it. That, oh, okay, I understand this.
This is a bit of a follow-up. I don't know that it was meant that way, but this person asks, I'm curious about ways you have been able to successfully negotiate between two such drastically different worldviews. It can be quite exhausting, impacting negatively one's very sense of self.
Yeah, I mean, just look over your shoulder. Again, that's delicious. Okay. So that's a very, very challenging question. I don't know that you can necessarily, there's not a synthesis to be made between worldviews in that sense. Like, they're not going to come together. I think that we can find ways in which your life experience can match the ways that you think. And for me, going into ceremony on a more regular basis and being connected to particular places, to me is kind of my best negotiation and my best self in understanding my own concept of self. When you go into those lodges, when you are able to, for me, to go hunt, that is a very important ceremonial time of the year. Going and making maple sugar are really, really important negotiations. And that when you're performing and those energies are going through your body, is the best and the closest I can feel. Again, remember, worldview is that kind of distant, unspoken stuff, right? So that's not necessarily at the forefront of the knowledge. There are certainly times where it is very, very challenging and conflictual, like going back home and fishing, but knowing full well that the Great Lakes are poisoned to the extent that I can't just go and eat the fish. Right, those are moments of dissonance that really cause much needed work to happen. Because you can't just go back and do your thing. Like, I literally cannot be and perform the things that I'm supposed to do, right? We've lost clans, we've lost Dodem, because the lakes are so poisoned, and so many people have died out that, we have to really, really be careful about what those relationships are. So, I really think try to keep into those ceremonial negotiations. Language is always a big deal as well. That's, best self forward, and negotiating as best that we can. It can be exhausting, yes. There's no follow-up to that. It's just really exhausting sometimes. You get your moments, when you do your thing with your family, and, for us with our kids, that's just always a big deal. How do we keep them going in this? So I guess I'll leave that one there.
So I think this is probably our last question. Dr. Freeland, while we now know more about Indigenous viewpoints than before, we seem to continue treating them as curiosities instead of as real tools to challenge master narratives. Do you see a way out of this? Yes. Yes, I do. And it's just hard work. It is sitting down with one another and having hard conversations. There's really no quick fix to that one. We have a lot to offer, and it's something to think about. And something I was trying to work in earlier, but I forgot to, is the phrase Indigenous audacity. Because there is a certain audacity in even just being here. I tell my students all the time, we can go to Briggs Library and I can show you book after book after book that tells I'm not supposed to exist. That other Indigenous students are like, we're not supposed to be here. Back in the early 20th century, it kept saying, nope, they're going to die off, and we're going to salvage their culture, and we're going to take pictures and put a canoe in a Smithsonian and call it good. But the audacity to could still be here. And not only just be here, like I'm not just going to be here and learn all y'all stuff. I think you all have a responsibility to learn some of ours. You're in our land, right? And that's okay. That can be okay if we're going to be a part of this and we can work together. Like, we have some really good things to say about how to do this well. Literally, our languages are built around kinship systems and relationships. We're really good at it. We're really forgiving. Like, when we took students to Pine Ridge for Dr. Bassett's oral history trip, a lot of people will go there and, we want to make sure that there wasn't going to be some sort of, poverty porn. And what we want to really make sure that people are engaged with, and I really do think this takes a lot of work, is that we're going to prepare you to experience beauty. Because with all of the base information around Indigenous people and the negotiation of poverty and violence and drugs and alcohol and everything, like, that's what people have in their minds, but we're going to prepare you to go see beauty. You're going to laugh because Indigenous people are hilarious, but we're going to prepare you to do that, right? And it's going to take some level of vulnerability to negotiate this in a better way. And I think there is something for all of us. And I'll finish with this audacity. And I know that this is very, very audacious to say, but I'm very, very confident that people are going to come and return to Indigenous ways. And I'm very, very confident in that because early on in colonialism, non-Indigenous people ran to live in our communities in huge numbers. They ran from Jamestown, they ran from Puritan colonies, they ran all up and down the East Coast, they ran to Haudenosaunee communities, they ran to Wendat communities, they ran to Cherokee communities. Over and over again. So many ran away to our communities, there were laws against it. You need to think about that. So many people ran away to our communities, they had to create laws against it. Not only that, an entire genre of literature was created to combat it. This idea of the, Gigi, help me out. So the Mary Jemison narratives, the captivity narratives.
right? People started writing these narratives in East Coast newspapers to be like, oh no, we found another one and liberated her from indigenous communities. That's junk. No, they didn't. More often than not, the women in particular were like, no, I'm going to stay here. Mary Jemison wrote about it. You can go read her book, right? She was captured when she was like 8, maybe 11 years old, and lived in a Seneca community, and then was liberated later on. She's like, no, I'm going to stay here. I can live way better with them. When indigenous people have intact communities, people can see the beauty in it and understand it and want to be a part of it. Now, I'm not saying go run to a community now. They're going to freak people out and they're going to shoo you away, right? However, in the longer term, we can engage this knowledge, we can engage with one another and be in relationship with one another and find these ways of living together in nearby spaces. That I'm confident in. The ways in which we can have our logics be engaged at the educational level and to build different ways of thinking about being in a relationship and being in a society with one another is really, really important. I think we have a lot to say and can offer that. So with that sort of indigenous audacity, I say, Chimagwachinen, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity and your questions. If anyone has any more, I'm always happy to take more questions via email and such. Chimagwachinen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freeland, for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Your work reminds us all that the core values of a liberal arts education continue to form the basis of a strong community and civil society. I especially commend you for addressing a socially and ethically complex issue with such clarity, thoughtfulness, and balance. Your lecture serves as a model for what discourse among educated citizens ought to be. I want to close by again thanking the Hendrickson and Cheever families for their support for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And finally, thank you all for attending this evening's virtual lecture. Your presence reminds us all that the human spirit embodied in the study of the liberal arts is strong and resilient, even in the face of challenging times. Thank you for everything you do for South Dakota State University and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Good night.